So this is a more use case sort of naming these CSS files. So instead of that, what we take in a Tailwind approach is collectively have these smaller utility classes put up together to create any HTML element that can be used as anywhere on your, this paragraph can be used as your author text, your media text, anywhere. So it works something like this. You have an HTML element and you append all of these smaller classes, and in return it gives you all the styles associated with it. You also have breakpoints to create those responsive designs, and on the other hand you also have states to assign certain styles to any states that you want. So how many of you have used Tailwind? And how many of you have gotten into a fight about Tailwind on Twitter? Somebody slyly putting up their hands here. So I think most of us have. And how many of you actually love using Tailwind? Okay. And how many are meh about it? Slow hands not coming up. But a quick story time. This was back in lockdown, and I had just heard about Tailwind. I did not have a lot of context about it. Neha, I'm sure a lot of you might know her. She organized a space where we're discussing Tailwind. And that changed a lot of things for me because I could hear a lot of perspectives around it. I could hear different people how they've used Tailwind. And this was actually, so this talk is actually inspired from this space. Neha was supposed to be here, but she couldn't make it. So Neha, if you're hearing, this talk is actually inspired from this space that we had back in lockdown. So let us discuss why devs don't prefer using Tailwind, right? One of the most primary reasons is it makes the code hard to read. But not just the code. It also makes the PRs hard to read. Experienced it? So just for some context, here's a checkbox from the Netlify dashboard. And these are how many CSS utility classes that it has. So yeah, I mean, fair point. It does make the code hard to read. It makes the HTML bloated, as we say. The second one being it locks you in a utility CSS paradigm. So what devs don't like is it has a vendor lock-in, it locks you in a paradigm, and you can't get out of it. So if you're using a lot of these utility classes, it's very tough to adopt any other framework that you want. And it's an unnecessary abstraction. So by abstraction here, we mean that since it's a combination of smaller CSS utility classes, it abstracts the way it's supposed to behave. Certain class name reveal the way a component is supposed to behave, and people consider that maybe using these smaller classes abstract the way it's supposed to behave, but the alternative would be @apply. But again, @apply has its own pros and cons, and that's for another debate that we should apply or not to apply. So we'll get into the debate later. Last one being it's wet, not dry. So simply dry means do not repeat yourself. How devs usually use Tailwind, they seem to be repeating themselves, and this is one of the behavior that they don't like. So how many of you here have not used Tailwind up until now? Okay, a lot of people. But how many of you have not used Tailwind because you didn't like it in the first go? Okay, then the second part is definitely for you. Have you seen this article somewhere around? If you're active on Twitter, you might have seen this a lot. So I would say give it 5 minutes. Initially, my impression with Tailwind was just the same. I didn't like it because I had not used it. So give it 5 minutes or give me some minutes to convince you otherwise, and let's see if we can actually enjoy using Tailwind. Just to analyze more about this particular framework, I went on to read what Adam, the author of Tailwind, had to say. And he has a wonderful article on these utility classes and something called separation of concerns. Separation of concerns isn't as complex as it sounds. It basically means keeping your HTML and CSS independent, and the HTML should take control of your structuring, and the CSS should just do its job in styling those elements independently. So he goes on to discuss how we've traditionally written CSS, right? So say suppose we have a paragraph and we want to give some styling to it, say text align center. We will attach a class name to it and give those particular styles. But what happens is, say suppose you're using a preprocessor, you fall into the rabbit hole where you're actually depending on the structuring that the HTML has, and it necessarily isn't following the separation of concerns in this case. So what do? You decouple those styles from the structure, right? So instead of having that structure, you create different classes for each of these elements and define a style to it. This is more of a BEM approach in CSS, but this does not work because maybe if you want to reuse these styles anywhere, it does not work. So you give it a more generic names so that you can use the same author bios in your media card, text, and so on. But again, aren't we mixing concerns now? Now the problem with separation of concerns is it isn't black and white. It is black and white. You can either have it or you cannot. And what we usually tend to do in these decisions of what frameworks to use, we take these things very seriously. But again, this definition of separation of concerns is very strong and very rigid. It isn't supposed to be followed everywhere. You can have it or you cannot have it, and there's no right and wrong here. So what now? So Adam thought, what now can we do? We make a content agnostic CSS. Say in this case, you have a button. You divide your styling into two parts. You can have some generic styles that all these buttons hold, and you have some specific stylings that only primary buttons have, right? So you have two CSS classes that are put together to form this styling. But let's say these buttons are supposed to behave differently in different parts. Button aligned to the right is supposed to have a margin left and vice versa. So you combine it with utility CSS. So instead of having the same styles in the previous classes, you make a smaller CSS utility class, say margin right, and this works wonderfully. So this is where utility first approach comes into picture. And that's one of the reasons why Tailwind was born. And I think this particular article gave me a lot of perspective into thinking, again, everything is not black and white. You can either have or don't have things basis your use case, your team, and your particular code base. So can we love Tailwind after all this? So I think that's where my perspective changed when I started reading about it and I started learning about it. So let's just iterate to all the points that we had on why people necessarily don't prefer it. So the question remains, why love it? Harder to read? But what about CSS? We often crib about getting our HTML bloated, but have you ever gone back and seen how bloated is your CSS? So we're all guilty of it. We have those unused CSS class names lying around there which are not used. But again, so one of these examples is from the CSS Tricks website, where this CSS is so underutilized, this file, but still we complain about bloated HTML. So the thing remains that there will some part which will always be bloated if it has to be. It can be HTML and CSS. We just care about HTML more because that's where our logic is, but that's not necessarily a reason to not like it. So again, right, you can have so many LOCs in your CSS file and you can say it's bloated. What I've learned through the way is Tailwind has a learning curve. What people don't like is this behavioral thing of using it, the syntax, but you need to give it some time. You need to give it 5 minutes for you to realize that this actually works. And once you get used to the way CSS is written, it becomes very intuitive for you to follow it after on. The second question remains, it locks you in a paradigm. But my question is, maybe it locks you into a paradigm, or it might enforce some consistency. Here's an example of these websites who have so many of these design tokens. What happens in smaller projects is when you go on to use your CSS files or your preprocessors, you have the liberty to pull up any color you want, any token you want, and that just bloats so many of these tokens. What I love about, even if it locks me into a paradigm, it really enforces consistency for me, because I am stuck to certain tokens that I can use. And they have these wonderful tokens, wonderful colors that might work. Abstraction. Again, as much as we love to talk about abstraction, we automatically abstract the way we want things to behave, right? So if this sort of abstraction is the way that I want to function with in my code base, I'm okay with it. Not all abstractions are bad. So this is sort of abstractions that I want to trade off with, which works wonderfully in my favor. So composition, composing all of these styles, using it as components is what specifically works. Mind you, the author itself says that just because you're using something like a CSS utility classes does not mean you can do away with using the component structure that you follow. You still need components for you to enforce reusability, and that just works. So maybe that's not one of the reasons that you could not love it. How many of you remember reading this book? And then you might remember this chapter where you learn how to name these JS variables. And I think until I did not read it, it was such a nightmare to do those. But again, naming CSS classes is equally hard, isn't it? So how many of you have taken a 10-15 second good pause while you're writing a CSS just to figure out what to name your CSS classes? Wow, that's a lot of hands. So again, right, this worked wonderfully when it comes to Tailwind. This is something that I enjoyed. So again, what it does, it basically composes this together for you to be able to use it again and again, rather than writing any use case specific classes that cannot be reused otherwise. And I think one thing that I've noticed is mostly when we get into this debate of to use or not to use, we form very strong opinions about certain frameworks. But that might be true for you, but that might be true for any other team structure, any other code that is being implemented. So after this, I sort of retrospected and heard what a lot of people had to say. Now the points which most developers say that they do not prefer Tailwind are the same reasons that this person here loves it for. So that might not be the case for every use case, and that's a good thing to have. It's okay to have strong opinions, but also to embrace things that are newer. So now the question remains, what worked for me? The speed. Again, for smaller projects or projects where I want to ship faster and in an efficient way, this worked wonderfully well. After an initial learning curve, I got used to these utility classes so quickly that I could feel the difference in speeding up my development process. Next thing, easy to pick up. I think in the previous comment as well, a lot of people claimed that this worked wonderfully well for them because it was easier for them to pick up. See, somebody who has not written a lot of CSS, the class names are very intuitive for them to pick up. But mind you, you cannot do away with not learning CSS. You still need to learn how CSS works. You still need to learn how to center a div to be able to use Tailwind. And because, again, these utility classes are directly put up, comes from these CSS rules that you have. And the last thing, I think it was the community. Community worked really well for me, especially for projects where I could just pick up certain elements. People have created wonderful component libraries using Tailwind, and it just helps me put together all these UI elements together. So this is one of the repository of all the components that you can use. You can just copy paste it, put it in a code, and this works wonderfully well, right? And it's not just repositories like this. The community around, so many extensions you have, your VS Code extensions. Maybe if you say that the HTML becomes bloated, there's specific VS Code extension that basically collapses those utility classes. So I think the community is awesome. But what about performance? I think Tailwind knew exactly what they would be called out for. So this is something that is mentioned in their repository as well. So Tailwind purges all the unused CSS out of their production build. So if you've seen any website that's built with Tailwind, if you go and see the final build, you would see that this final CSS file that's generated, it only references all the class names that have been used in your code. So it does not push in all the CSS that you might expect you have. So I think you could go to the sources tab and see what the CSS generated looks like. So I think on the performance part, it works well. So I think the question remains, you love or you hate. Again, this is very specific to what people might think would be suited for the use case. I would say still there are use cases where such a solution might not work perfectly well. Say you have very complex animations, or you want to have many specific styles basis your states. The chaining becomes a little difficult. This might not be very useful there. You have a legacy code base where you're using something like a CSS and JS. It might be hard to transition into it. But again, that's a pro-con that is more specific to a use case rather than generalizing is Tailwind is bad or Tailwind is good. It's something that you can say depends on your use case, and that's the thing that you need to keep in mind when you're talking about it. So at the end, you love or hate, your users don't care about the CSS drama. Your users care about what the final website looks like, what the final UI looks like, how it behaves, how performant it is, and so on. So at the end, it's more of a developer pros and cons fight as to what you think works best for you. But you don't need to worry about this because your users don't care about it, right? So I think one thing that I would suggest in my experience of working with Tailwind, that if you haven't used it, or if you are of your opinion that you don't like it, go back, use it. The developer documentation that they have is amazing. Once I gotten used to it, it becomes very intuitive for me to follow anything. And finally, if you have to use in a project, just create whatever pros and cons list you have, basis your use case, and that will work perfectly good for you. So I think in the end, it does not matter because again, your users don't care about this drama. What works for you is efficiently handling all the UI elements that you have, and that was about it. Thank you. I hope you had a wonderful time.